Thank you very much, Dino, for speaking up for vegetables and what vegetables can do in terms of improving human nutrition. Now I turn to the next speaker, Lloyd LePage. Lloyd is the CEO of the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research, CGIAR, the consortium board in the US. Lloyd, you have 10 minutes.
Thank you. Not in the US, now in Montpellier, France, as of the end of this month. So thank you. I'm going to change subjects slightly to talk more a little bit about what we've already learned throughout most of this conference about the complex research challenges ahead of us. And we've learned from the last three speakers about some of the detail in that science and the great investment that has gone forward that was invested some 10, 15 years ago and today are paying fruits. And that is one of the key points that I'd like to raise, is that research in this area is a long-term investment, and we need to always be mindful of that. What we face today is a complex situation. Increasing demand through population and economic growth, urbanization, changing diets, changing landscapes. We have the increasing challenges of climate change, energy and food crisis, and now increasingly political instability. But many are being left behind. Many are being isolated, many isolated not only in volume, but isolated nutritionally. And this is a global challenge, not just about the developing world. It faces all of us. Globally, we must invest today in long-term and sustained agricultural research to prevent food crisis of the future, and as a consequence, political and economic instability in 2020 and beyond. We cannot solve food, nutrition, and health challenges without also managing fragile ecosystems, including forest areas, and more sustainable use of natural resources. So these challenges are highly complex. And the challenge and complexity of sustainable nutrition security for health requires us to use all the tools at our disposal. First of all, as you've heard, we need to increase the volume through more rapid rate of productivity gains. This is not only good for populations, but also good for the environment, providing more for every unit of resource consumed, including energy, land, and water, and reducing pressure on more marginal areas. To do this, we need to have all the tools at our disposal, tools of science innovation to double crop production on existing arable land, including in remote areas, using traditional knowledge and breeding, IPM, modern and organic farming methodologies, crop rotations, molecular tools, biotechnology, agroforestry, and many, many other tools at our disposal. Through these productivity gains, for example, the CGR's new research program for rice, GRISP, led by member center IRI, along with Africa Rice and SEAT, aims to raise 150 million out of poverty by 2035. But solving health and nutritional issues is not just about volume and quantity of food. It's also about quality. We've learned a lot about that today. New innovations allow reduction in fungal disease with less mycotoxins. Wise use of IPM allows reduced use of pesticides. New technologies allow improved nutritional quality, digestibility, and bioavailability. And new crop research allows improved and increased crop and diet diversity. Other tools include biofortification that we've learned about already from Howard, and a more diverse range of vegetable crops for vitamin A and zinc and iron availability, for example. And we can also improve protein sources through improvements in livestock, improvements in fish, and also in pulses. Enhance vitamin and essential element sources, improve value chains, and availability amongst the rural and urban poor. And importantly, we also need to reduce losses. Not only the losses prior to harvest, but also losses after harvest, and even post-consumption through access to clean water to reduce diarrheal diseases. But to provide these solutions, we must access the best knowledge and technologies available, both in the public sector, the private sector, from academic sources and civil society. And access to these innovations provides lasting and sustainable solutions, and that requires a radical and urgent partnership revolution. We heard a lot about the green revolution. I really believe that we need to take it to the next scale and really to talk about a partnership revolution. We need to cross sector boundaries, and we need to work rapidly at scale. It requires the private sector to embrace solving the challenges of the poor. It requires public institutions to embrace private enterprise. And it requires long-term commitments to research that doesn't stay in the labs, but is rapidly disseminated and adapted with and by farmers and their households, mostly headed up by women. Partnerships are critical to secure and deliver new innovation for public good, particularly in crops and diseases or areas that are currently underserved by the private sector. And whether we're talking about more nutritious varieties of sweet potato or healthier grains, research should not be confined to the lab. It includes research at the farmer level, with farmers, by farmers, for farmer households, and most of them women. It also includes research on markets, trade barriers, and value chains. So many of our centers are working on those fronts. And in order for science and technology innovation to improve livelihoods and health of the poor and the most vulnerable, clear recognition in research must be given that the rural household is really the nexus of agriculture, health, nutrition, sanitation, and education. And that's an important factor as we put together our research programs. But agricultural research investment pays off. Our CGIAR scientists work closely with hundreds of partners, including farmer groups, national extension and research, local and international private sector companies, civil society groups, and academic research institutions to find the very best solutions. We look for holistic and lasting solutions at the household and village level. When we look at the public investment in international agricultural research through the CGIAR, world production would be, without that, world production would be 4 to 5% lower. Developing countries would produce 7 to 8% less food. World food and grain prices would be 18 to 21% higher. And 13 to 15 million more children would be malnourished. For every dollar invested in CGIAR research, $9 worth of additional food is produced in developing countries, where it is needed the most. The evidence is clear: agricultural growth alleviates poverty and hunger. So what are some of the barriers of this partnership revolution for agriculture and health and nutrition? And there's been a lot of work that's been carried out by the CGIAR centers, mostly by IFPRI, but many others as well. And I'm not going to go into all the details. But from personal experience, I'd like to highlight a few of those areas. The first being an apathy and lack of urgency. A sense that it is really someone else's problem and that the other sector or the other institution or the other country will solve that problem. Poverty and malnutrition are no longer just their problem, they are ours. Wheat harvests or deforestation in one region, one country, can and do have an impact that can be felt on the other side of the planet. And we need to be increasingly aware of that. We must get past the sector divide and mistrust. We must reach across the divide between agriculture, health, and nutrition. We must reach across the divide between public and private sectors, between institutions, and we must get past the silo mentality. Apathy also shows itself as the sense that the status quo is acceptable and that somehow the problem will go away. That grain yields in Africa, 1/6 of the rest of the world, are acceptable. That 1 billion people and growing are undernourished and go to bed hungry is somehow acceptable. And we must get past this phase of analysis paralysis, as I call it, always looking for the perfect solution and perhaps never finding it in this rapidly changing environment. By the time we find a solution, the problem has already changed. There's also a lack of willingness to try and a lack of funding to try new things that might fail. Our funding systems are bogged down in the search for the perfect. We must secure funding for adaptation and real-world solutions that allow scientists and the farmer households that they serve to learn as they go. To be willing to fail if by failing and less than perfect solutions we learn. We also need to incentivize dreaming. We need to fund and provide adequate resources for funding some blue sky thinking to solve these challenging problems ahead of us. And it's also about lack of long-term commitments and accountability. We need to get beyond the project mentality and election cycles. Research success demands long-term commitment to achieve a full pipeline with room and time to filter out imperfections. We must get beyond funding of pet projects and knee-jerk responses to crisis. We need to prioritize our research very carefully, and we intend to do so. So very quickly on potential solutions, and there is many to this. Firstly, of course, we need to commit to long-term investment to support agriculture research. We also need to examine areas like orphan drugs legislation that happened in the States and created a whole industry of new solutions to diseases that were being left behind in the mainstream. That can also happen in agriculture and in that connection between agriculture and health. It creates policy incentives for long-term agricultural nutrition and health research partnerships. We can also examine combined extension models at the village level, such as rural development nodes that include para-health, para-agronomist, and para-sanitation workers all working together at one village development node. So with that, I would like to leave you with those thoughts at that time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lloyd. And now I turn to the last panelist. The last panelist is Siva Msangi. He is a senior research fellow in the Environment and Production Technology Division of IFPRI. Siva, the next 10 minutes are yours.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm going to fill in today's discussion not so much on the technologies, but actually on the policies, and the policies that help enable technologies to take off and really be adopted and applied in the way that we expect. And because there's so many examples of where we've seen policy to be necessary, especially when it comes to technology development, protecting intellectual property rights, and providing essentially the producers of technology with the incentives to innovate because you've enabled them to capture the returns to investment that come from their particular technology. So there are many, many examples of where that occurs, and also examples where enabling the private sector to go into certain types of technologies or certain types of activities that they wouldn't otherwise do on their own, where there isn't a priori a clear-cut case for profit making. And I think there's very many useful analogies that can be drawn between how agricultural technologies can benefit from that type of intervention when we look at how certain types of health products have been made available, where the ability for, or where governments have been able to sort of say, well, we'll make sure that your intellectual returns and your profits are protected for these markets if you let go a little bit and allow these technologies to diffuse into places that really need it. So targeting and being able to allow innovation and diffusion and adoption of technologies where it wouldn't otherwise happen just purely by private benefits is always a good role for policy to play. And as just been, and as Lloyd has just alluded to, just the push for investment, sort of making sure that there's enough push from the public side as well as the private side for certain key technologies. Or whenever I run into Phil Pardee these days, he tells me, and Phil Pardee is one who's done a lot of work in terms of agricultural R&D, he tells me that looking again at some of the data, they thought that some of the 20 to 30 year lags between the investments and the outcomes that are noticed in terms of improved productivity might actually be more like 40 and 50 based on some more recent analysis that they've done. And that already tells us that, you know, the outcomes that we want to see in 2050, we needed to make those investments last year, basically. And so there's a very clear need for that. I know that there's been talked a lot about in this particular context, in this particular conference. And I think there's a lot of many good examples where the policy settings and I should say the development orientation of particular countries has affected the way in which they approach agricultural policies. I mean, the resource-rich countries, the countries that fall into these natural resource traps, they come across an abundance of natural resources. All of a sudden, policy shifts towards getting those rents from that particular resource. You start to grow a non-productive, non-export-oriented public sector. You forget about some of your comparative advantage, and sometimes along the way you neglect those the education, the technology investments that would help, especially that would help once the resource runs out and it helps you to get competitive again. So there's many good examples where that has occurred. Examples of where that hasn't necessarily been the case, like Indonesia, which started on par with Nigeria in the 1960s, but because of some very conscious efforts to make sure that there was still enough investments going into agriculture, they were able to keep that engine going while they were still also getting things from their extractive sector. So I think there's a lot of examples about how that orientation, and there's many, many countries that we know of very well, where that shift towards trying to make those rents, and the politicians who want to use those resource rents in order to get their supporters on board will neglect some of those important ones. And there's actually some good empirical work, and I'd be happy to give you references of where people, when they actually look at the data and they measure sort of which are the most influential channels through which resource abundance tends to slow down growth. Surprisingly, some of the biggest avenues tend to be actually through the effect that it has on depressing investments, the effect that it has on closing economies towards openness. So the policy linkages that help, that slow down, I should say, growth as a result of this are very, very important. But I think there's always a risk when you talk about science and technology of always focusing on the productive activities. And I think from what the keynote that Ruth gave this morning, and from some of the things that many of the presentations that have happened in the course of this conference, we're constantly reminded that there's this other sector. If we take, let's say, borrowing from the framework that John Hodnett presented in his keynote, if we think of the reproductive activities that occur within the household, the economies of care and nurture, and there's a lot of really good literature that goes into this, and this is where the domain where unpaid work of women plays a big role and basically provides that care, and the renewal of the labor force within the household that enables them to then go out and bring in income through productive work. There's a lot of technologies too that are relatively low-hanging fruit that can make a big difference in that sector of the economy as well. I really liked Ken Davies' example yesterday in the parallel session where he mentioned these partially cooked foods that are packaged in a way that it reduces basically the cooking time within the household. And when we know from the data that when we look at time use data that that is a huge area in which time is spent within the household. So that's already technology that is there, that has been proven. And we've known from the many examples in certain talks about the clean drinking water, that perhaps is the number one time use activity when you look at the data, and the technologies for making that can be rolled out both at the systemic level in terms of providing the water, as well as what can be done to purify it at the household level, I think are things that can be used. And usually number two behind water collection is the time spent for collecting biomass from the environment in order to provide cooking and heating fuel. And a lot of the technologies that we hear about, and actually there's many developing countries that undertake biofuels programs, renewable fuels programs, it's aimed at the transportation sector. Not a lot of it is aimed at the household level. And I always like using biofuels, and it hasn't earned me any friends among the Renewable Fuels Association of the U.S. as an example of where policies sometimes go against what the objectives sometimes are. So even if you have, let's say, within the U.S. program, a push for developing now these second-generation technologies that won't rely on the food crops, you still have policies in place that are acting against that. First of all, you give them tax credits on the basis of volume rather than energy content, which automatically favors the corn ethanol. you also, if your objective, let's say, is to reduce carbon emissions, you're putting up your high tariffs that are keeping out the Brazilian ethanol, which actually has a lower carbon content. So there's a lot of examples, both in developed countries as well as developing countries, where policies in place will actually retard the innovation and the rolling out of technologies that are going to meet your spoken objectives. And there's a lot that can be done with that. One good example that in terms of how policies keep out very useful technologies, as you know, if you looked at the World Bank's infrastructure diagnostic, you know that ICT, the communications technology, has been the fastest penetrating technology on the continent. It's almost like 90%. If you see the statistics that Vivian Foster rolls out. But there's some countries where those technologies are actually being kept out of the hands. And this is not Ethiopia being a good example, and not to pick up on Ethiopia, but it's just a good example of where it's one of the few places you can go and you can't get access to that technology. And we know by looking at countries like Kenya, where Safaricom has made cell phone technologies very pro-poor, allowing transfers of funds. You can imagine the ability to be able to have people receive funds directly, like what Ruth was saying, the importance of getting that funds into the hands of women. Those technologies are very useful. Right now, I believe India's undertaking a huge effort to get people identification cards for people who've never been able to have that before. Again, those technologies that allow people to be more easily identified, to be more easily targeted, are the types of technologies, exactly the types of technologies we should be helping through policy. I'm not going to go on for very long, but I just wanted to also point out the example of where sometimes we can use technologies to lower costs. And there is a high cost sometimes to low prices, and providing cheap calories at whatever, and regardless of what the external costs are in terms of health or environmental costs. And sometimes that happens because of a failure of policy. There's many examples, let's say in the case of the US, where the fact that education policy leaves much of the funding in the hands of school districts locally, the school districts then turn to the fast food companies for help, and they install the fast food machines and the soda machines that actually work directly against nutrition aims. I know that's a rich country example, but it's an example nonetheless of where a failure in policy has led to actually rollbacks in terms of nutrition outcomes. So, just to state quickly, again, the points that good policy can help in targeting, it can help in the innovation, helping countries design and target their own, and make their own priorities in terms of which technologies they want first, for instance, the biosafety programs. Looking also at the reproductive sector. What are the low-hanging fruit? What are the technologies that can help reduce the constraints there? And also making sure that policies don't also hide the true cost of always providing low prices and cheap calories at whatever cost. Thank you very much.